One of the most important developments in gaming over the last 10 years is the proliferation of early access. This allows a developer to release an unfinished game and get feedback while still receiving payment for it. Steam's version of early access launched in 2013, and one of its greatest success stories is Darkest Dungeon. The early access version launched in January 2015, and critics have loved it from the start, but it's still undergone a ton of changes even past its full launch a year later. A sequel is already on the way, and the original launched into Game Pass last month. Its dungeons are dangerous, but is it a serious threat to your free time? Let's find out if Darkest Dungeon is a Game Pass or a game fail.
Continue the onslaught.
Darkest Dungeon is a roguelike horror RPG where you dive into dungeons to earn loot and build a team that can eventually clear its titular final dungeon. It's designed to be difficult, and the game warns you every time you boot it up that every decision is permanent. Characters will die. We've played it on the easier Radiant difficulty, so we aren't getting the darkest of the Darkest Dungeon experience. The game itself recommends this for first-time players, so we aren't entirely chickening out. Plus, if we were unable to make much progress, this episode wouldn't be all that interesting or informative. Even on this quote-unquote easier setting, it's certainly not a pushover, but keep this caveat in mind as we dive deeper.
This expedition at least promises success.
Darkest Dungeon is a turn-based RPG at heart, and the mechanics work well. Each of the 4 characters in your party has 4 attacks to use, and there's a heavy focus on both ally and enemy positioning. The combat is interesting, with each attack making a strong impression.
A decisive pummeling.
The biggest challenge is dealing with status effects, since it's impossible to take enough supplies to prepare for everything, especially if you want to take the spoils of war out of the dungeon with you. Sanity is one of the game's defining mechanics. As you delve into dungeons full of horrors, it takes a toll on your party's mental stability. Simply walking around can send them into madness. Take too much stress damage, and mental afflictions will arise, ultimately resulting in death. It even persists between missions. The primary way to counter it is giving party members some time off with some leisure activities around town. It costs you gold, and possibly some other penalties.
There is a great horror beneath the manor.
So far, Darkest Dungeon has been more punishing than difficult. If you go into an encounter unprepared, your party members will die for good.
Mortality clarified in a single strike.
It adds a lot of tension to each skirmish, but common sense precautions help a great deal. As long as you bring a healer and enough supplies, it's not too tough in the early going. Knowing when to retreat is another lifesaver. However, none of this keeps it from turning into a grind. Gold is in no short supply, but the special resources you need to upgrade the various town facilities are. It can be difficult to make much meaningful progression.
Anything to prolong a soldier's life.
Darkest Dungeon has a lot to give, but you need to give it a lot of time to get there. We do wish that the story was a little more overt and structured. There's a lot of deep lore, but it's broken up into pieces, and it's easy to ignore when you are focused on just surviving. There are tons of RPGs and roguelikes on Game Pass, but surprisingly few games that combine the two. Card-based roguelike RPGs like Slay the Spire are the primary competitors for your time, but none of them have a more traditional structure like Darkest Dungeon. There are plenty of traditional RPGs on the service that do supply that, with the Final Fantasy games leading the pack. Whether you are looking for more explicit horror like Alien Isolation, or something more cerebral like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, horror games are also numerous on Game Pass. All the disparate elements of Darkest Dungeon are available in other forms on the service, but no other game brings them together into one cohesive package. Now it's time to find out, is Darkest Dungeon a Game Pass or a game fail?
Obliterated.
Darkest Dungeon finds success by exploring and expanding on a niche and executing it extremely well. The RPG combat is sound, the hero management works well, and the stress mechanic adds a new dimension to almost everything else. It's easy to see the game's appeal, but it's also easy to see that it's not for everyone. If you are willing to buck convention and settle in for a serious challenge, it's definitely worth the download. While we are not entirely sure that we are up to the challenge ourselves, there just isn't anything else like it on Game Pass. Darkest Dungeon is a Game Pass. For next week, the randomizer selects Jade Empire.